Okay, great souls, here we are again. Surprise, surprise. Everybody's in their accustomed seat. I'm in my accustomed spot. It's like we've been here for a very long time. But we have been. You know, these gatherings have a way of moving out of time and space in a very pleasant manner. One of the many key concepts that Swami Kriyananda really infused into our understanding of the spiritual life is to help us to understand that this is not a sort of either I'm spiritual or I'm not sort of situation. We have this very extreme, linear way of thinking about things that is really doesn't really apply when you're working like this. When you think about, for example, you plant a seed, that seed sprouts and then it begins to get all the little pieces and it gradually becomes a big plant, and if it's a tomato or something like that and it begins to grow, it swells from its origin point until it reaches its destiny. And it's so, I'm not a farmer. When we first came to Ananda at the beginning, in 1971 is when I arrived, you either went into the farm to grow food, you put on a tool belt and went out to try to build structures, or you went in to cook. And I went in to cook, so I never really learned to build or to grow food. But I sprouted lots of things and so on like that. So I got aware of the fact, and I would you just often contemplate the miracle of a seed, if you're thinking at all. I cut open an apple and you have that tiny little seed in there. And it looks like, what could it be? And then I look out my window and I see a little apple tree growing outside. Maybe that's where this apple came from. And all that potential is right there if it's just given a chance to become what it's supposed to become. But there's nothing you can do, and this is why farmers are often very patient people. There's nothing you can do to get it from here to being an apple tree. You can yell at it, you can bully it, you can shame it into trying to become an apple tree. You can put it in Coventry. I mean, you can ignore it. You can put social pressure on it. But it can only progress according to the way it was made. And it has to go through every one of those stages. And you never think about that the apple tree, the apple seed is being naughty because it's only a seedling. It's just doing exactly what it is. And if you're a farmer or a gardener or have house plants or anything, you coax it, you take care of it, you cheer it on. You're so happy when it makes its first little green shoot and it starts, that's how you normally relate to it. But that isn't normally how we relate to ourselves. With ourselves, we have this very odd idea that somehow or another there's a timetable that we could force by some kind of usually malicious misunderstanding that we apply to ourselves or to people around us. So one of the things that Swamiji really emphasized to us is a simple word, and that word is directional. And he talked to us about how all spiritual growth is directional. It's not absolute. It's not like I'm bad or I'm good. It's like we're all drops of water that are heading for the sea, and we're all going to make it all the way to the sea. There's not a chance in the world that any one of us is not going to eventually figure it out and do the right thing. There was, in the early years of living at Ananda Village in our extremely isolated world up there, before most of the places had electricity, and Swami Kriyananda's dome, which is now, for those of you who visit, it's part of the Crystal Hermitage, and it's the sort of the circular living room, which is the main room. That was his entire house. And if you look up, you see this sort of spray foam ceiling The whole house was just that. No grounds, no gardens, no nothing. In fact, you just walked down the hill through the forest, down this little trail, and you came to this little dome that was just sitting there. You walked right in, and that was the whole story. And there were propane lights, or Aladdin lamps, we called them. Was that called Aladdin's? Yeah, kerosene lamps with the little ash thing. My mind blanks at the word right now. So yeah, it was a wick. So the whole energy was isolation and completely separate from anything else. And he started writing The Path about 1974, I think. And every Thursday night he would invite us to come down to his house, and he would read to us the chapters that he'd finished writing. And especially during the winter, it would just be completely dark outside because there's no other buildings around, and then there would be these little pools of light where the propane lights were, and you didn't know where you were. I mean, you could have been on another planet for anything like that. It was quite evocative of very deep feelings. And I remember one of those satsangs, and Swamiji would have different, there's a Sanskrit word called bhav, which there's no English word for it. You might say spiritual mood, but it's deeper than that. It's just the upliftment that you feel inside yourself. People who speak English didn't really talk about those things very much, so they don't have very good words. But bhav is one of those beautiful words. And sometimes Swamiji would just be somewhere else. He would be with us, but he would be somewhere else. And one of those nights in that dome with the black night out there and the little pools of light, after the whole thing was over, he looked at us, this sort of room, maybe fewer people than is in the room now, maybe 30 of us, maybe 25. There weren't a lot. And he said this, "You're going to get it right sooner or later." He said, "Why waste a few million years?" Just like that. And in the moment, you couldn't think of why you would waste all those millions of years. Of course, once you got out of that room and back to your own self, you could think of lots of reasons why you would. But it's still, that thought just comes in really deeply. Why am I wasting so much time chasing things that won't fulfill me when I have been gifted to know where I'm supposed to go, the direction I'm supposed to go? But the word that Swami would often use was directional. And here's another way of thinking about that. I've touched on this, and it's a very important thought in the context of the world that we're living in now. Because it's very easy to become quite upset with what I called the first night Divine Mother's rowdy children who are on the planet with us. One of the nice things about the astral world is that it's a homogeneous vibration, which is you go to the astral plane that matches your energy. When my friend Linda Gerber was dying, and she had a beautiful sense of aesthetics, and she would decorate our church every year for Christmas. She was just a wonderfully beauty-oriented person and very dear. And she was on her deathbed, and Swamiji came to visit her. She died relatively young of cancer. So she says to Swami, "Tell me about the astral world." And this is written up, I think I've written it up somewhere, and it's also, Nalini wrote a marvelous book called Transitions with Grace, it's not read often enough. I encourage you to buy that book. It's like 21 stories of people who were yogis who died. Because, they're wonderful stories, all of them. And there's a great deal written about how yoga helps you live, but there's not that much written about how yoga helps you die, which is, it's sort of like, this is a pioneering movement. This I figured out recently. This is a pioneering movement. So we've been busy building houses, growing food, making relationships, making money, making children, educating those children, and guess what happens later? Old age, disease, and death. But we're all just like figuring out how to do this because we've been figuring out how to live the rest of our lives. So now we have to figure out how to end our lives. Because in this culture, well, no culture in the world, people really just don't know anymore. We've forgotten all these truths. So when Linda asked Swamiji, tell me about the astral world, first thing he said was, well, he said, you'll love it there. You'll feel very much at home. Where you're going, it will be beautiful and you'll be surrounded by saints and angels. And then he said, but don't get too comfortable there. He said, you'll like it too much. He said, you have to come, you have to finish your spiritual life. You can't just settle in. But the nice thing about the astral world is that it's all homogeneous vibration. You can see the higher worlds, you can help in the lower worlds. But on this planet, it's heterogeneous, meaning there's all good and bad people, and we're all just mixed up together. You can be living right next door to people of really, let's be honest, terrible consciousness. You know, just who don't share the values that you have at all. This is why the material plane is a good place, because there's an incentive. That's what he was warning Linda. If it's all beautiful and just the way you want it, I'm sure all of you know, just as I know, the worst times always turn out to be the best times, don't they? Because when you're hammered to a pulp by life itself, then you begin to understand things that you wouldn't have understood before. Master objected to this. He argued with Divine Mother. Why do you have to teach your children through suffering? He said. So I feel if he felt sorry for us, I can feel sorry for myself a little bit sometimes. But the problem is, it does seem to drive us. So if we're just too comfortable and happy, we just don't have an incentive to change. My friend Shivani put it, until you're absolutely disgusted with the quality in yourself, you won't put out any energy to change it. It has to become unbearable, because the effort required then to change has to be less than the effort required to endure a little bit longer. When you reach that tipping point, that's when you begin to shift. That's just the way it works. But what Swamiji really wanted us to understand, in talking about the heterogeneous vibrations where I was going, you know, and we talked about this a great deal the first night, but you know, God loves all of us just the same. And the divine does not measure us by some mythical perfect standard. So we're always measuring ourselves against some mythical perfect standard. The divine is interested in one thing: which way are you facing? Which way are you walking? It's just directional, because we are that apple seed trying to become an apple tree. And if it's still in seed form, you can't be upset with it, because it's not a sapling. It just simply can't be a sapling. It doesn't have it in it to be a sapling. And the apple seed will grow as fast as it can, but the conditions have to be there for it to be able to grow. And so all of us, I mean, we don't willfully waste 1,000,000 years. We just waste 1,000,000 years because, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time. You know? But just the energy wasn't there to do it. And from the divine point of view, all of us, when you have a child who's 3 years old, if you have a child who's 9, you have very different standards for those two children. What's fully acceptable for a 3-year-old, even great work. One of my friends who has 5 children, when the 5th child was there, and they were celebrating the fact that the child had learned to use the potty. And so the full potty was being paraded around the dining table so that everyone could cheer the youngest child. The husband looked to the wife and said, "Are we here again?" You know? But that's precisely what you have to do, even though it's like, this is not something that grown-up people are really excited about. But the little child, it's an incredible victory, and it has to be cheered. We always talk about Divine Mother, Heavenly Father, because we're trying to develop the right bhav. We're trying to really understand who we are in in this reality. And what's so extraordinary is that Divine Mother is pleased with even the smallest movements upward. You know, you can be a terrible murderer, kill the whole family, but spare the baby. And Divine Mother cheers, because given who you are, what you understand, what you might do, if a little bit of light comes into the picture, hooray, hooray! We're learning, we're learning, we're learning. And sometimes, you know, terrible punishments have to be terrible consequences. That's the right word. You don't want the word punishment, because that puts you in the wrong bhav, puts you in the wrong relationship. But there are consequences. Actions have consequences. And actions we don't remember have consequences. That's why the thing is so annoying, is that we don't remember. We don't remember setting this energy in motion. It's like a boomerang. I've never had a boomerang or thrown one, but I know the concept. You throw it out and it goes in a big circle and then comes back and hits you in the head, right? And you toss it out. You know, you steal somebody's inheritance. You are unfaithful when you should have been faithful. You take an opportunity and you squander it. And it's an energy that you throw out like that. And it makes this big circle. Maybe after many lifetimes, because there's something called the thwarting cross currents of our own ego, which is we have all this power and we're working like this, and that's the, you know, we throw it out like that, we send it away from us, but it doesn't forget where it came from. And so by the time it comes back to us, we are so surprised. Really? For me? Why for me? Like this. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. But the energy is always, you know, what comes around goes around, or however they say that. It really happens to us. And then we're in the process, after we set all that in motion, which we are. Question was asked earlier, why? I don't know why, but here we are. And the only reason it needs to come back to us is because there's something we need to understand. You know, I've certainly received a lot of the consequences of my wrong actions in this life. You know, why don't people like me? Why are they not being nice? I remember once I was accused of doing something that I didn't do at all, but I could have. You know? And it was just like I was innocent, except I wasn't. I hadn't actually done it, but it was perfectly consistent with something I would have done. So I figured I was just wiping away some other reality. So we're here because we need to understand things. And what we're trying to understand is perfect unconditional love, perfect acceptance. And as I said, and I have said several times, love is not weak. Love is not the same as being nice. Yeah. There's certain qualities of the divine, and nice is not necessarily one of them. So it's not a question about being sweet and harmonious or anything like that. It's standing in the truth, whatever is true. And if someone's behavior is unconscionably awful, it's simply unconscionably awful. And one can look right at it and say that's what it is, because what we're also being asked to do, you see, is to respond appropriately. And appropriate is one of these words that you have to get really clear in our heads. We have to respond appropriately according to what is forward for us. Okay? So it's not about what it looks like, it's what, and I've used the word vritti a lot of times, it's the energy at the center of the vritti. I was raised in a household where my parents didn't argue in front of the children. They didn't actually argue much at all. And my father particularly had a real aversion to conflict. He really did not like conflict. And I absorbed his hesitancy. And I was accommodating. But I wasn't actually accommodating. I was afraid of conflict, which of course is a very different thing. And I began to realize that I had a way of behaving, but the center of the vritti, the center of the energy that was causing me to behave that way, was fear. And fear is not a truth. And that's when I realized that nice is not necessarily an attribute of God, because what's asked of us is that we have the courage to be appropriate. And you know, many of these masters were quite intense. You know, Jesus was no shy wallflower. He stood up multiple times until they actually took his life because he was so powerful. Yogananda in this lifetime had a warrior-like temperament, but he talks about being William the Conqueror and Fernando the Third in Spain, who both of them just, their lives were nothing but war. I mean, they fought and they killed. It's just really like, wait a minute, you know, what is this really all about? It's about behaving appropriately in circumstances, which sometimes means we have to just stand up for the truth no matter what comes. I had a lot of food for thought with a friend of mine, very strong young man. He was about 30, very dedicated to the spiritual path. And he said he was very, very good at dying for what he believed in. And he felt like in many lifetimes he died for what he believed in. He was with William, and he was with this one, and he was a soldier here, and he was doing all these things. He said he rarely made it to the age of 30. And now he found himself at the age of 30, and he was just still here. He hadn't, like, you know, thrown his life away in war, and he was having to figure out how to live for what he believed, because it's just like was a skill he hadn't developed yet in his life. But you can see that would be how he would need to grow. When I was very accommodating and harmonious, I wasn't. I was just afraid. So I had to learn to fight. I had to learn to be rude. I had to learn to take offense. I had to learn to stand up. And here I am in Boston. And I was living in New York. It was a great place to learn. Super good place to learn. Because, you know, New Yorkers are not like Californians. What would be considered just unthinkable in California was just, you know, the way you got up in the morning and went to the market in New York City. And I practiced standing up for myself and knocking people out of line when they cut in line, and telling the grocer that he was adding to my bill and you just better not do it. You know, everything like that, until I began to enjoy it. And then I realized I'd gone too far. But I had grown what I needed to grow in the right direction that I needed to grow. Interestingly, later, one particular incident, many years later, well, not that many, 5 or 6 years, one of my friends really needed somebody to argue with. She really needed somebody to fight with. She, by contrast, had grown up in a family where everybody yelled at everybody all the time. And we were doing a project, and she just reached the end of her tether, and she was blowing her top, and I thought, oh, fight with me. So right in the middle of the publications department at Ananda, we just screamed at each other until it was finished, you know. And afterwards, and it was great because I didn't care. I love her. I know her well enough. That was just what she was going to do. And I thought afterwards, that was so lovely. Because Divine Mother needed somebody to fight with her, and I had learned how to do it. You know? We're here to serve. And one of the reasons that we're here, no, seriously, we're here to be, I know that sounds funny, doesn't it? We're here to be instruments of the divine. And so the more free we are within ourselves, the more the divine can use us. And I realized right in that moment, my friend needed something, and by the grace of God, years earlier, I was ready. I was just ready to be able to help her, and I was so pleased with myself for being able to do that. Because it was the direction of freedom for me, to not be so nervous about anything that moved outside of my little box. And so now when we're talking about superconsciousness, I mentioned the first night that I was standing here, the way Swamiji described this, there's basically 3 states of consciousness, and I mentioned this before, what he calls subconscious, which is used slightly differently conscious, superconscious. Subconscious is everything we've already done for all of our incarnations. Because, well, in the Bible, at an extremely dramatic moment, Jesus is there and he's praying. He knows he's about to be crucified and he's having a conversation with God. Jesus' prayer at this point is extremely instructive. He says, Lord, let this cup pass from me. He had an honest opinion about what he wanted to have happen, and he spoke it. But then he said, but thy will, not mine, be done. And it wasn't that he was afraid to die. He was heartbroken that he had brought this truth to people and they couldn't accept it. They so much didn't want to hear it that they were going to take his life. That was the bitter cup he didn't want to have to drink, is that his love would be so, as Swami says in the song, spitefully rejected, like this. But he prays that God's will be done, not mine. And then he says also, save me from this hour. But then he has this marvelous line, but for this hour was I born. Oh, and you hear it and you see Jesus marching along and, you know, the angels are there and the whole big crescendo of the orchestra, for this hour was I born. It's so magnificent. But you know what's really weird to contemplate? Every single one of us can make that same declaration. Right now, this minute, we were born for this minute. Wherever you're standing, you have no idea how many incarnations we have gone through and worked to develop ourselves to the point, this is who I am, right now. And this is my destiny. This moment is my destiny. And it's every bit as important and as dramatic as the destiny of Jesus. We're all equal before God. When we do our Festival of Light tomorrow, those are lines Swami put in. God loves everyone equally, not just Jesus Christ and Krishna and all of those, but even those who have sinned most greatly, is how Swami puts it in the festival, just to make it dramatic in our minds. You know, that we're all equal and we're all standing on the precipice of, guess what? Our next step. I mean, that's all you're ever standing in front of, is your next step. We think somehow that I'm going to be like lifted up by some flying eagle and he's going to take me somewhere else, you know, but it's not true. For this hour was I born. Everything in all my life experience has brought me to this opportunity to make a decision about what my next step is going to look like. And that's both, well, I think it's simply absolutely wonderful. And also, whatever way we're going, guess what? We can just move it. There was a period of time, and I don't remember the context, but it was early when my first years with Swamiji, that I'd managed to get myself into some kind of a kerfuffle, which I was really pretty good at that. I just got myself into some mental kerfuffle and nothing was going properly. And I was feeling, I was très dramatic in those days, and so I was feeling very dramatic about it. All by myself in my little trailer, just having, you know, this little Sarah Bernhardt moment. And then I just thought to myself, you know, I got myself into trouble by wrong attitudes and wrong actions. I can just turn around and walk back. I mean, it was just as simple as that. I could just turn around and walk back. And somehow or another, I had to go to town, which was the big thing you did in those days. You went to town, and I had to go to a grocery store. And I remember being in the grocery store, and you know how it is, sometimes you're walking on one part of the aisle and you see someone and you don't want to talk to them and you pretend you don't see them. Well, there was this couple there, and part of it that got me in so much trouble is that I just didn't like anybody. Nobody met my standards. So they didn't like me either, but that didn't cross my mind until much later. But so I saw this couple down there that I didn't like very much, and so I pretended that I didn't see them. Then it crossed my mind that that was precisely what was making my life so miserable, was that I was shriveled, had this little shriveled heart. Nobody was good enough to come into it. So I turned around, I walked down the aisle, I greeted them, I talked to them, and they were lovely. And oddly, interestingly, we never became close friends, but from that moment for 25 years, there was some special bond between us. It was very odd. We didn't have much in common, we didn't work together, but there was just always something, and I felt it was Divine Mother's grace that I had actually realized, for this hour was I born. What am I going to do right now? And as I mentioned the other day, subconscious has a whole lot of momentum. It has one really simple thing. It's super familiar. I just know how to be this way. It doesn't say I'm happy this way. It's just like, I know how to be this way. This is a rhythm I know. It's called low energy. I'll just sink into what I'm used to doing, and I'll just keep doing it. Yeah, I'll just keep doing it, because otherwise I have to generate creative, higher energy to chart a new course and send myself in another direction. So we just keep sinking back, and this has to do with the vrittis and the spine and all of that. The mechanism of subconscious is the vrittis in the spine. I'm heading this way on the river, and then all of a sudden I'm in a whirlpool. I mean, has that not happened to all of you? You just think, this is what I'm going to do, and then suddenly you find yourself doing something else. Whether it's yelling at someone you promised you wouldn't yell at, or having crawled back in bed when you thought you were going to meditate, and suddenly you realize that you're there, oh dear, here I am, how did I get here? Just because that's where the energy went. So what we have to be thinking about all the time, and let me just pull this together, and the superconscious is our potential. And it's not just super conscious in this like tremendous way, it's just not subconscious. It's just, let me think in this moment what is really appropriate. When I worked for Swamiji, which I did for 3 or 4 years, I worked for him. I was actually his secretary, and he actually paid me. He opened his wallet once a month and gave me $50, which actually at the time was enough. I had this little trailer that was all paid for, $150, all paid for. They absolved me of community fees out of respect to Swami. So he opened his wallet, and he would hand me $50 in cash, and I would put it in this little opaque jar. This was my financial system. And then every time I needed money, I would put my hand in. I didn't look in, and I didn't count. And there was always money in there. I don't know how. And when there wasn't, I would find $20 in my jacket. You have no idea in those days, $20 was a huge amount of money. There was no possibility I could have lost it. Although I had a couple of friends who would slip money to me. So it occurred to me many years later that I think some of those $20 bills I found were given to me by my friends. I had one friend who just always knew, and he would just pass money to, he had more money than I did. But Swami would pay me out of his wallet. And part of my job was every day, every weekday at 4 o'clock, myself and my sister friend Seva, we would show up at Swami's house at 4 o'clock. There was no phones, there was no internet, nothing. Swami was completely isolated, writing, and we would bring the mail over and any phone messages and so on. Every day we'd show up. I made no plans, absolutely no plans, because you'd walk in at 4, maybe you'd leave at 4:30, maybe you'd leave at 2 in the morning. It just depended on, I don't know, all kinds of things. So I never had any plans. I'd walk in, and Swami would invariably be surprised to see us. And he would say something like, "To what do I owe the great honor of your company?" And we didn't say, "Because it's 4 o'clock, Swami, we're always here at 4 o'clock." Because it was actually his actual real consciousness. This is one thing I gradually learned about him. I could behave well. I could behave well because I could master my lesser impulses and hold them in check. But Swamiji just perceived reality differently. And I actually had the opportunity, because he had asked me to write about him from when I was maybe 25, or the first year I was there, even when I was 24. And so he answered my questions. So I found this out later, that he was treating me somewhat differently. I didn't realize that for a long time. But I could ask him, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Because he wanted me to understand. So I said to him, sir, I have the feeling that you actually literally just wipe away any expectation. And it's one of the exercises that he recommended to us, is that every night when you go to sleep, you build a mental bonfire and you throw all your attachments and expectations into it. And then the next day you see what God has in mind for you. And I felt genuinely, that's what I said to him, I feel like you just give up any expectation. And so the next day it's always a brand new and wonderful surprise that we're so generous that we come and see him again. He paid me to come over in the afternoons, but he never saw it that way. It was always new. It was always new. It wasn't an affectation. It was just, how delightful. You've decided to come. And then, I had this work. It's like he was writing, I was typing his manuscript, but he would never say, oh, hello, lady, type my manuscript. He would always say, I had a very good writing day, just as one way of saying it, or you'll really like some of the changes I've made. Oh, sir, would you like me to type the manuscript? Would you? You know? But it wasn't manipulative. You know, you can read in books to treat people like that, but it wasn't. It was because he didn't live in his subconscious. He lived in the now, in the possibility of expanded awareness, and he expected the same from me. He treated me like I had perfect freedom to do or not do. It was just, now, there's thousands of iterations that you can go from that, but you can see what that means. But think how that feels inside yourself. How many of us are divorced because we forgot how special the person we were with really is. And we just put them in the box of what we expect them to be and just live in the subconscious. Why? Because it takes more energy to live in the superconscious, and the security of the superconscious is not the well-worn path, the familiar resentments, the comfortable, this is how it's supposed to be-nesses. It's just, here I am, this is a new moment in time, everything today is different. You know, what does Divine Mother have in mind for me? And of course, we're not stupid. The more spiritually in tune you become, it doesn't make you ineffective or dumb. It makes you free. And it also makes you happy. It's just such a different reality. Now, it is directional. This is where I was wanting to say. Every situation always has a duality. The nature of this world is everything is dual until we actually realize God and come into the center. You know, we think this world is very complicated. We think God is very complicated because the world is so complicated. But the fact is, the closer you become to center, the simpler it gets. Because everything is this oscillating duality. The more it oscillates, the more extreme this is as it begins to come to center. And this is why, well, we can love everybody. As Swamiji put it so simply, he said, it's not like we love everybody individually, and some people are not very lovable if you were just going to ask whether they're attractive or nice. But the divine is equally present in everyone. And if we're living here and we understand that that same divinity is everywhere, it's very simple. Appropriate may be to express it even by putting someone in prison, because nice is not necessarily one of it. It's like we have to live by the truth. What is the truth here? And that also is directional, because one person needs to learn to stand up and fight, and another one needs to realize, honey, you don't always have to fight. You can just put down your tools. You can be nice. You know, that would be appropriate. Some people need to be told that is absolutely unacceptable. And just, I will not stand for that. And it's all about directional. But the point being, there's always a top and a bottom to everything. And so the way we play it, and this is so simple, but will change your life. In every situation, if you can't do your best, try not to do your worst. Just as simple as that. I remember I was very upset with someone once, and we were in a public place, and I just got really annoyed with them. Somehow I lost my patience. And I played this out. We are in a public place. I could begin to scream right now. You know, that's the worst. I could begin to scream right now. The best is I could assume Christ-like forgiveness. I could be untouched by the waves of Maya. Nope, not an option. That's the best. This is the worst. You know, where do I move in this? And I've managed to, get out of the public place, calm down, recognize that this was not the end of the world. But there was no doing nothing. That was just a level beyond me, but I didn't have to do my worst. Another simple way of thinking about this is we always have a choice because the subconscious is very contracted compared to the expansiveness of the superconscious. So we ask the question, what is the most expansive action that I can take at this time in this situation? What is the most contracted I can take? Contracted meaning self-concerned, self-protective, small, ungenerous. Or you can think of it in terms of energy, because it takes more energy to be on the superconscious side than to just go with what we're used to. So how can I always put out a little more energy? I mean, it comes down to very simple things, I loathe housework. I think that's actually the word for it. And I'm very proud of the fact that I'm advanced in years and I've managed almost never to vacuum my own house. I'm observing that I'm going to make it through without ever having to run the vacuum cleaner myself. I'm very proud of this. So it's not like some people I know actually relax by cleaning their house. Unfathomable to me. But I don't mind kitchens all that much, and I like to cook. But so I don't mind leaving. I can easily go to bed with dishes in the sink. I'm not like some people who could never sleep. I can, no problem for me. But I will think, okay, the only reason I'm not doing this is because I'm lazy and I don't like to do this kind of work. That's my worst. My best is that I'll spiff it all up before I go to bed. Not an option. But I can stack them a little more neatly. And consciously, believe it or not, as an act of superconscious living, whenever I can see that I could do a little better than my worst, I do it. And add that up, moment by moment by moment by moment. And you see, that's how real change takes place. We want change to be dramatic and emotional, and I had a breakthrough, and, like this, and it's never, it always makes me nervous, like when people tell me, I learned the lesson. Oh God, I hope you did, because there's too much like this, because that's not how the apple seed becomes an apple tree. And that's just not how we're growing. We're seeds becoming flowering, enormous flowering trees. And we grow piece by piece by piece. Now there's so much more that you can say about superconsciousness and attunement, but it's like always asking the right question. And the right question is a really simple question. How can I grow? How can I serve? And we have lots and lots of more complicated questions, and you have to ask God a question that He has an answer for. I learned this early when I was faced with a very complicated situation in which it was a perfectly either-or choice. There was no shades of gray. I either did this or I did this. And this was in my très dramatic period. And so I was always asking God what he wanted. And I was telling everyone around me that I wanted to know what God wanted. And somehow or another, I got all the way to Swami's house, and he was sitting in a soft chair, and there was a hassock in front, and I was on the floor, and I was sitting on the floor sort of talking, and I was telling him how desperately I wanted to know what God wanted, and God wasn't answering me, and then I cried out, "It's so hard to know what God wants." Then I threw my head on my arms. Swami's his saintliness is demonstrated by the mere fact that he put up with me. And I began to weep, just weep. It's so hard to know what God wants. And Swami just very non-reactive, no judgment, just sitting there very quietly said, "No, it's not." Just, "No, it's not." And then I waited for him to say something else. I thought that was like the opening salvo, but it wasn't. It was the entire conversation. And after a while, I kind of saw that nothing more was coming, and I managed to just stand up and say my goodbyes and walk up to my little trailer, which was just up the hill. And I sat down in my little meditation space, and this is, you see, it's very interesting when you watch your mind do something sneaky to justify your position. Like by the time I got up the hill, I had changed his words. And I'd changed his words to, "It's not hard for me to know." The implication being, "Why are you having so much trouble? I don't have any trouble." I had changed it into that. But by the time I sat down and so I was like, well, like this. So by the time I got to my meditation space, though, and I sat down, all of a sudden I actually heard what he really said, is that it is not hard to know. So I suddenly became quite interested. The little huff scene was over. And so I thought, well, it's really hard for me to know. And I ended up having this conversation inside my own mind with Swamiji, which is how he would reach us. And I said, well, it's really hard for me to know. Why is it so hard for me to know? He said, because you don't want to know. Right. Which is very annoying, extremely annoying. And I said, well, why don't I want to know? And the answer was, again, very simple, because you're afraid. Oh, I understand this. Fear is something I get. And I realized in that moment, I knew exactly what I had to do. It was perfectly obvious what I had to do. I just was afraid. So then the question became, why am I afraid? And that's a real question. It wasn't a real question, what should I do? What should I do? It's, why am I afraid? Oh, because it's going to be really hard and awful and this isn't what you want. Oh, okay, I understand that. So I learned from that, and I've never forgotten it. If I don't get an answer, I'm not really asking a real question. Because our mother loves us and wants to help us. Our guru loves us and wants to help us. But if we ask a question for which there is no answer, or we ask the question in such a way that the answer is incomprehensible to us. So now, and I can't say that I'm perfect at this by any means, but when I get myself organized, I remember, oh, it's not that God's not going to give me an answer, it's that I'm asking the wrong question, or I'm afraid to know. And often we ask the wrong question, like, do you want me to live in Chicago and take the job in the big hospital, or do you want me to go to St. Louis and take the one in the small clinic? Which one, which one, which one? And the answer is really crushing. God doesn't care. The question is, how can I serve? How can I love? And if we're just asking, what should I do? He doesn't care what we do. How can I serve? Now that's a question. How can I love? And that's all we ever have to ask. And wherever you are, how can I serve? When I have to face those dishes, I have a housemate, and he's pretty good. We're pretty even, let's just put it that. We get along, we're pretty even. But sometimes I'll do it because I know when he gets up, it'll be better. How can I serve? And it's not like I have to. You know, if I don't feel like doing it, he'll do it, and it's just fine. That's the question we ask. What is the worst? How can I do better than my worst? If I can't do my best, try not to do your worst. Put out a little more energy and ask the right question. You know, a superconscious wants to bless us and make us free. So how can I expand my consciousness? How can I serve? How can I live more in the light? It's really not, let me say it differently. It's not easy, but it's not complicated. That's what we have to understand. It's very, very simple, but it's not easy. So to avoid having to face that, we make it complicated. But even once you're spinning it, that's your clue. Why am I spinning it? Why is it so hard? It's not hard to know what God wants if I really want to know, if I really want to move. And then sometimes you just have to say, no, I can't do that. That's what little children do. Jyotish's son once came back after getting in trouble with some of the little children, and he was about 6 or 7. And when the boy was all calmed down and very wise father's talking to him, he says, you know, because we're a community, you know, we know why that little boy was acting out, and, you know, he's having a little trouble, this is happening, that's happening, maybe you should just try to be his friend. The son said, Daddy, I don't want to be that good. And that's fair. I don't want to be that good. Swamiji encouraged a couple of, on several different occasions. One woman wrote and said, this man is so difficult to get along with. Swami writes back and says, why don't you just be his friend? She wrote back to Swami, his friend? I don't even want to be in the same room with him. You know? It was just honest. I had to say to Swami he'd asked something of me, which was a very good thing for him to ask of me. I wished I could have done it. But I couldn't, and I didn't want to be insincere with him. I said, sir, you asked this of me, not an option, can't do it. He didn't even take an extra breath. He said, so much for theory, let's work with reality. That's all he said. And then he gave me another suggestion, which I could do. You know, and I've thought, gee, if I could have risen to that, maybe this, but it didn't matter, couldn't. But I didn't do my worst. That's all that we need. Just take that home, keep it simple, keep it super simple. Everything in this world is complex, God is very simple. We are loved. We have all the time in the world. We can waste a few million years, but we have all the time in the world. And we are an apple seed becoming an apple tree, and there's not one step of that process that we can skip. Just give it the right conditions, and we will have it. Okay, my friends?